What happens when a woman on the run from her past crosses paths with a man who's buried his heart in the desert? In the silence of Monument Valley, two broken lives collide, and what follows will leave you breathless. Love, danger, redemption, and a secret that could destroy everything. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. They say the desert keeps its secrets, but that morning the land gave one up. Caleb Morgan had lived in the quiet folds of Monument Valley for over 2 decades. His ranch sat at the edge of the sandstone world, surrounded by red cliffs that stood like forgotten gods. He liked it that way. No visitors, no voices, no memories crawling in uninvited. But that day, as dawn clawed its way across the horizon and spilled light into the canyon like liquid fire, she appeared. He saw her first as a blur, a shape that didn't belong, moving against the stillness like a ripple on water. Dust clung to her boots. Her dress, sun-bleached and worn thin, flapped against the wind, and her dark braid swung in rhythm with each step. She walked alone from the eastern rim, the place where no one ever came from without meaning to. And when she stopped at the broken gate to his property, her eyes lifted, and they locked with his like a dare. "You, Caleb Morgan?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it settled into the space between them like thunder rolling in slow. He didn't answer, just stared. You don't spend 20 years in the desert and forget how to read danger or heartbreak. And she carried the scent of both. She stepped closer. "Name's Ruth Callahan. I heard you work with wild horses. I want to learn." Caleb lowered his eyes to the rifle in his hands. He didn't lift it. Didn't have to. His silence had always been warning enough. Ruth stood her ground. She didn't plead or shrink. She didn't fidget. She just waited. And maybe that was what got him. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't ask twice. Or maybe it was the hollow behind her eyes, the kind of emptiness a man like him understood too well. "Why here?" he finally said, voice like gravel dragged over stone. "Because here's the only place left that might let me start over." The words hung heavy. Honest words often did. And they didn't come from desperation. They came from somewhere deeper, darker. Caleb studied her again. No ring, no suitcase, just calloused hands and a posture that spoke of sleeping on hard ground. She'd walked far, probably ran further. He nodded once slowly. "Mornings at 6, you keep up, you stay, you don't, you're gone." No handshake, no welcome. That was all she got. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just nodded as if that was more than she'd hoped for. And so it began. The first lesson was silence. The corral had never seen a woman since his wife walked out, and it creaked under Ruth's presence like an old saddle pulled from storage. Caleb showed her the tack room, the feed bins, the paddock boundaries. He didn't explain much. Didn't need to. Ruth watched with the eyes of someone who had learned everything the hard way. She didn't complain. Not when the shovel blistered her palms or when the mare kicked dust in her face. She worked. God, how she worked. By noon, her sleeves were rolled, her skin red, her shoulders trembling. But she didn't stop. Caleb watched her unseen from the shadows of the barn. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. On the third morning, he found her already inside the paddock brushing down one of the fillies. The animal didn't shy away. Ruth's touch was firm but kind. She spoke in murmurs, low and patient. "They don't trust easily," Caleb said, startling her. She looked up, smiled faintly. "Neither do I." He hadn't meant to smile, but it tugged at the corner of his mouth anyway. That night, Ruth didn't return to her bunk right away. She lingered by the fence, staring out at the stars. Caleb found himself walking toward her, drawn by something he didn't want to name. You ever lose something you thought was yours forever? She asked without turning. He didn't answer. I did, she said. And then I lost everything after that. He wanted to ask what, wanted to know who, but he didn't, because men like him knew better than to ask about ghosts. The next day, Ruth fell. The horse reared, and she hit the ground hard. Caleb was there in seconds, crouching beside her. I'm fine, she muttered, though her breath came in gasps. You're not, he said, and for the first time his hand touched hers. It was a moment of flicker, but it rippled through him like heat off canyon rock. She didn't pull away. Later that night, he stared at the flame in his lantern and cursed whatever had brought her here. Because Caleb Morgan had spent 20 years building walls so high, even his own memories couldn't climb them. And now, this woman, this stranger, was scaling them without permission. There was something about Ruth Callahan. Something quiet and tragic and strong. And he knew, without needing to ask, that she hadn't just come to learn about horses. She came to bury something, or maybe to dig it back up. Either way, the storm had already begun, and neither of them was ready for what was coming. The morning after Ruth Callahan fell from the saddle, the valley was unnaturally still. The kind of quiet that carried weight like the hush before a confession, or the breath held before a storm. Caleb Morgan rose before the sun as he always did, but the silence outside his cabin wasn't the same. It was expectant, like the land itself was waiting for something to break. He found her in the barn, already awake, her back to him as she brushed down the old gelding with care. Her movements were deliberate, slow, like she was trying to ground herself in something real. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. He wasn't sure if she knew he was there, or if she simply didn't care. You should have told me, he said finally. Ruth didn't stop brushing. Told you what? Whatever it is that brought you here. She paused, the brush hanging in midair, then lowered it gently. Would it have changed anything? Caleb didn't answer. Because maybe it would have. Maybe he would have said no to her that first day. But he hadn't. And now, the idea of sending her away made his stomach twist in a way he didn't like. People don't just show up in Monument Valley to chase a dream, he said. They come to run from something, or to disappear. Ruth turned her eyes shadowed. Then, maybe we have more in common than you thought. There was no argument to be made against that. Caleb carried his own ghosts thick as the canyon dust, and some days it took everything he had just to outlive them. Work went on, it had to. The horses didn't care about pasts or regrets. They needed feeding, grooming, riding. Ruth threw herself into it harder than ever. Caleb noticed the way she moved more cautiously now, the slight wince when she twisted too quickly. Her fall had bruised more than bone. But her spirit wasn't broken. If anything, it was sharper, more focused, as if the pain reminded her what was real. One afternoon, Caleb found her sitting by the fence with one of the younger colts whittling a piece of driftwood. She didn't speak when he approached, just handed him the carving, a small, crude figure of a horse, rough but unmistakably powerful. He turned it over in his calloused hands, feeling the shape she'd coaxed from nothing. You used to do this, he asked. She nodded. Back in Colorado, before the fires took everything. Fires. Forest fire, then a different kind. The kind that comes with bills, and bad men and broken promises. Caleb didn't push, but he listened. And in her silences he began to hear more than words. Nights were hardest. The wind howled different after sundown, carrying voices from the past. Caleb knew them well. He often sat on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, listening to the land whisper names he'd long buried. It surprised him then, when Ruth joined him one evening, 2 mugs in hand. She didn't ask permission, just sat, close enough to feel but far enough not to touch. "Tell me about her," she said without looking at him. He didn't need to ask who. "Anna." He said the name, tasting like rust. "She left the day after my brother died. Couldn't stand the silence. Said I wasn't the same. Maybe I wasn't." Ruth nodded slowly. "Grief changes people. Sometimes it hollows you out. Sometimes it makes you cruel. I was both." They sat without words after that, the quiet settling over them like a blanket. Caleb glanced at her profile in the fading light, the way the breeze lifted her hair, the way her hands curled around the ceramic. He wondered what she had lost, who she had been before the fires and the running. But he didn't ask. Not yet. The next morning, she beat him to the barn. The horses had already been fed, the tack room swept, and fresh water filled the troughs. He found her in the far stall, murmuring softly to a skittish mare. "You planning on stealing my job?" he asked. She smiled without turning. "Just trying to earn my keep." It hit him then this wasn't temporary for her. She wasn't passing through. She was planting roots quietly, stubbornly. And it scared him more than he cared to admit, because people who stayed could leave. People who mattered could hurt you. That night, a storm broke over the valley. Lightning cut the sky in half thunder, cracking the earth wide. The horses panicked, and Caleb rushed to calm them, only to find Ruth already there, arms spread wide, voice firm and soothing. Together they moved through the stalls, calming, reassuring. And when it was over, when the last roll of thunder faded into the mountains, they leaned against the same wall, breathing heavy and wet with sweat and rain. "You always stand in the storm?" she asked. "Used to," he said. "Then I learned to wait them out. Maybe that's why they keep coming back." He looked at her surprised, but she didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Caleb lay awake that night, the storm long gone, but the echo of her words ringing in his chest. Something had shifted. And for the first time in 20 years he wasn't sure if the silence he'd clung to was his sanctuary or his prison. Either way, Ruth Callahan had opened a door, and he wasn't sure he wanted it closed again. It started with a shadow. Not one cast by sun or moon, but by something unseen that slithered into the air and settled like a warning beneath the skin. Caleb Morgan felt it before he saw it. The horses were uneasy that morning, their ears twitching toward the horizon. Even Ruth seemed different, quieter, more alert. She hadn't spoken much over breakfast, and the bruise along her ribs was healing, but her eyes kept drifting to the edge of the canyon. Caleb thought maybe it was just the wind, or maybe he was imagining it, until he found the footprint. It was fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth along the creek that wound just past the northern boundary of his land. Too big to be Ruth's, too wide to be his own. Caleb knelt beside it, studying the depth, the direction. Someone had been watching them. Maybe still was. He didn't tell Ruth right away, not because he didn't trust her, but because he knew the look that would enter her eyes. That mixture of panic and guilt that had crept in once before when she'd let her guard down. He wasn't ready to see it again. He wasn't ready to know what it meant. But she knew anyway. That evening he found her behind the barn, kneeling beside a rusty barrel. Flames licked the dry air, swallowing pages one by one. Caleb stepped closer and saw her face lit in orange and gold, a face carved by fear, not fire. "I found a boot print," he said softly. Ruth didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. "They found me." It wasn't a question. She stood wiping her hands on her skirt. Her shoulders sagged, not from fatigue, but from something heavier, the kind of weight a person carried too long. Caleb watched her closely, searching for something she wasn't saying. "You going to tell me who they are?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. She looked out toward the dying light where Monument Valley met the sky. They were my husband's problem, not mine, but he's gone now, and they think his debts are mine to pay. Caleb stepped forward. Debts? He borrowed from men who don't forget. And when things went bad in Santa Fe, I ran. Thought if I got far enough, I could be someone else. Somewhere else. Her voice cracked at the edges. Not from fear, but from the exhaustion of carrying a truth too long in silence. I didn't come here to bring trouble, Caleb. I came here because it was the only place left that felt untouched. I thought, maybe I could disappear into the land the way you did. The words hit harder than she could have known. Caleb turned away, running a hand over his beard. He knew that need, knew that ache to erase yourself so completely no one could ever find what was broken. But ghosts, he'd learned, didn't vanish just because you stopped saying their names. The next morning, the air was thick and still. Caleb walked the perimeter with his rifle. No new tracks, but the feeling remained. That pull in the gut that something was about to snap. Just before noon, the dust came. It rose like smoke along the canyon floor. A narrow trail of motion moving fast and purposeful. 3 riders. He counted them through his scope eyes narrowing. One tall and thin, the second broad-shouldered, the third with a scar running down his cheek like a brand from hell. Ruth stood at the barn entrance, pale but steady. You know them? Caleb asked. She didn't speak, just nodded slowly. The riders stopped at the gate. The scarred man stepped forward, voice loud and cold. We ain't here for a fight, Morgan. We're just here for what's owed. Send her out and we'll be on our way. Caleb didn't move. This is my land, he said, his voice calm but firm. You don't make demands here. The man sneered. Then you'll bleed for her. Ruth stepped beside Caleb, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. This is my fight. Not anymore, Caleb said. The moment cracked like a bone snapping. Guns lifted. Tension screamed through the valley like a warning wind. Caleb moved without thinking, pushing Ruth behind him as he raised his rifle. But the riders didn't draw yet, not fully. They turned their horses, kicked up more dust, and vanished down the trail. Retreat maybe, but Caleb knew better. He closed the gate and turned to Ruth. You should go, pack what you can, leave before they come back. Her eyes met his, fierce and full of something that looked a lot like defiance. No, I've run far enough. That night, they fortified the barn, reinforced the windows in the cabin, and set lanterns along the fence line. Ruth moved with the precision of someone who'd lived under siege before. Caleb saw it in the way she checked each lock, counted each nail, and in the quiet between preparations he watched her. Watched the way she stood alone in the field, shoulders squared, hair loose in the wind. She had come here broken. He knew that now. But she wasn't brittle. She was forged by betrayal, by loss, by fire. And he couldn't remember the last time he'd admired anyone more. As the night deepened and coyotes howled in the far distance, Caleb sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. Ruth came beside him, not speaking, just sitting in silence. He wanted to say something, wanted to ask why she hadn't told him sooner, why she'd waited until danger was at their doorstep. But he didn't, because deep down he understood. Sometimes the truth was too sharp to offer gently. Sometimes you had to wait until someone was willing to bleed with you. And tonight he was. Whatever storm was coming, it would find them both. Together. The gunshot came before the sun. One sharp crack that shattered the morning like glass. Caleb Morgan was on his feet before the echo faded, rifle in hand, heart thundering with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was war. and war he knew had a way of waking every bone that age and pain had long silenced. Ruth was already moving when he reached the barn. Her hair was loose eyes, wide boots, half-laced. The horses were in a frenzy, hooves clattering against the stall's nostrils, flaring like trumpets of warning. She met his eyes without speaking, but in that look everything was said. They were out of time. The peace they'd built with sweat and silence had just been shattered. The second shot splintered the post near the corral gate. Dust flew up like smoke. Caleb dropped to one knee, sighting down the barrel. He saw them, two of the riders from before this time, with bandanas over their mouths, and eyes mean with intent. No more pretending, no more parley. It was death they brought. "Get to the house," he barked. But Ruth didn't move. "I'm not leaving you." There was no time to argue. A third shot rang out, grazing the porch rail. Caleb fired back, the crack of his rifle echoing through the canyon. One of the riders ducked reins, jerking his horse, stumbling sideways. They split up then. One flanked the barn, the other circled wide. Caleb saw it happening and knew he couldn't hold both directions. He turned to Ruth. "Take the back, watch the north trail. If you see him, you shoot, don't think." Ruth nodded, her face pale but set. She slipped out the rear door, a revolver clutched tight in her grip. Caleb watched her go with a pang he didn't have time to name. She was brave, fiercely so, but this wasn't just survival anymore. It was something deeper. It was defiance. The first rider came fast low in the saddle gun raised. Caleb stood firm. He fired, once missed, fired again. The rider jerked, shoulder hit, and veered off, disappearing behind a ridge. Caleb cursed under his breath. The second was already at the barn. He ran. He burst around the corner and collided full force with the man. They crashed into the dirt, rolling in a cloud of dust and fury. The rider was younger, stronger, but Caleb had rage, years of it, buried deep enough to power fists that had once shaped fences and broken wild horses. He swung with everything he had, connecting with the man's jaw. They wrestled in the dirt until Caleb slammed the back of his rifle against the man's head. The body stilled. The silence that followed was heavy, pulsing with adrenaline. Caleb stood breathing hard, blood dripping from his lip chest, heaving. Then he heard it. A scream. Ruth. He ran. Toward the cabin. Toward the sound. Toward the fear clawing at his chest like talons. She was at the porch, grappling with the wounded rider. The man had grabbed her by the arm, dragging her backward. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, one boot missing, but her face was pure fire. She swung the butt of the revolver into his ribs. He grunted but didn't let go. Caleb didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle, aimed low, and fired. The shot caught the man in the thigh. He dropped Ruth with a howl, falling sideways into the dirt. Caleb rushed forward, kicking the gun from the man's hand, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the rider's temple. The rider spit blood and snarled, "You don't know what she is." Caleb's voice was a whisper. "I know she's mine to protect." Behind them, hoofbeats thundered. The scarred leader reappeared on the ridge, watching the scene with rage boiling in his eyes. He didn't come closer, just raised a finger and pointed. "We'll be back, and next time we'll take more than blood." He turned and vanished into the canyon, leaving dust and silence behind. Caleb knelt beside Ruth. She was shaking hands, clenched breath ragged. He touched her cheek gently, and she leaned into him, the tears coming, then silent, shattering. They didn't speak. Words would have only cheapened what passed between them. He held her until the trembling stopped. The fallen rider groaned. Caleb looked at Ruth. "You want him dead?" She shook her head slowly. "Let him crawl home and tell the others what he found here." Caleb nodded. He tied the man's wrists, dragged him to the barn, and left him there to stew in his failure. He'd send him out come morning. Let the desert judge him. That night they sat on the cabin steps side by side, hands bloody, hearts exposed. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the desert wind carried only silence. "I thought I lost you today," Caleb said. Ruth looked at him, eyes soft but sure. "You found me instead." And in the darkness that followed, neither of them felt alone. The canyon had burned, but they were still standing, bruised, tested, shaken, but standing, together. And the night whispered no more warnings, only the sound of a rifle resting beside a door, and a woman who refused to run anymore. The day after the gunfire, the land held its breath. The sun rose over the cliffs with a softness that felt almost apologetic, as if even the desert understood the weight of what had happened. A cool hush stretched across Monument Valley, touching every ridge, every stone, every scar left behind in the dust. It was the kind of morning that asked you to remember, and to begin again. Caleb Morgan stood at the fence line, eyes trained on the horizon. The rifle still rested against the porch behind him, but his hands were empty. The silence was different now. Not the silence of solitude or fear, but the silence after survival, after choosing to fight. Behind him, Ruth emerged from the barn, her hair braided again, her clothes fresh, though her movements carried the echo of pain. She didn't speak, only came to stand beside him. Together, they watched the sun rise, higher, slowly peeling away the shadows like old skin. The night before had left its mark not just on the land, but on them. Bruises bloomed along Ruth's arms. Caleb's lip was split, one eye darkening with a welt. But those wounds were shallow compared to the ones neither of them spoke about, the ones that had lingered longer than any outlaw. Grief, betrayal, loneliness, guilt. They had been passengers for too long, but now perhaps it was time to let them off. Ruth broke the quiet first. "I don't want to run anymore." Caleb turned to her. "Then stay." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was an offering. Ruth looked at him, her expression softening, the hard edge of survival beginning to yield to something gentler. "I'd like to make something here," she said, "something that doesn't need running from. Then we build it." And so they did. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed. The broken boards on the porch were replaced. The barn doors rehung. The corral was reinforced with the help of a Navajo neighbor who lived out by Totem Pole Mesa, a man who remembered Caleb from years ago and offered his assistance without questions. Ruth threw herself into work. But this time it wasn't just to survive. She worked with purpose, with a lightness that hadn't been there before. The horses responded to her. So did the land. The grass grew thicker where she walked, it seemed, and the barn never sounded so alive as when she sang softly to the colts at feeding time. One day she proposed something new. We should start a rescue for horses, maybe even people, those who've been abandoned, beaten, lost. Caleb didn't answer right away. He thought of the years he'd spent walling off the world, convinced there was nothing left worth reaching for. But now here was this woman battered by life, and yet somehow still blooming, asking to build something out of the ashes. He nodded. "Let's do it." They began small. 2 mares from a neighbor's dying ranch, a skittish colt found tangled in barbed wire along the southern trail. Ruth nurtured each one as if it had carried her secrets. Caleb taught young ranch hands from nearby towns how to mend fences, tend to hooves, and move with quiet authority. Soon, word spread. A widow from Bluff sent a letter. Could she come? Could she bring her grandson who hadn't spoken since his father died? Ruth wrote back herself. "Yes, bring him. There's room here." And there was. The house that had once echoed with nothing now pulsed with voices. Laughter returned tentative at first, then fuller, the kind that filled up corners long since emptied. Children rode the trails, veterans slept easy in the bunkhouse, and the barn held more than hay it held healing. And in the middle of it all, Ruth and Caleb. They still worked in silence most days, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not heavy, not empty, just comfortable, shared. At night, they sat on the porch watching the moon rise over the buttes, fingers brushing together between sips of coffee. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Ruth asked once. Caleb shook his head. "I didn't think I'd end up anywhere." She smiled. "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe," he said, "but they won't find us the same." And it was true. Whatever had tried to break them had only made them stronger. Together they'd turned battle into belonging, blood into beginning. On the morning of the equinox, the entire canyon blushed gold. The children ran barefoot through the creek. Horses whinnied in the warm light. Ruth stood at the fence with a newborn foal nuzzling her side, and Caleb, standing just behind her, watched as the wind caught her hair and lifted it like smoke from a long-doused fire. She turned eyes sparkling. "We made it." Caleb stepped closer, laid a hand on the fence beside hers. "We're making it." And in that moment, as the desert bloomed beneath the rising sun, as the weight of old wounds gave way to the breath of new hope, they weren't just survivors. They were something more. Builders, believers, family. And if you're still here, still listening to this story, maybe you're a part of it too. Maybe you've felt what it's like to carry something heavy for too long. Maybe you've looked for a place where you didn't have to run anymore. If so, then let this be a sign. There's always a new sunrise waiting, even in the deepest parts of Monument Valley. The story of Caleb Morgan and Ruth Callahan is not just one of bullets and bloodshed. It's a story of silence broken, of lives once lost and rediscovered, of strength found in vulnerability, and of love not as a sweeping romance but as a quiet, steadfast choice. Caleb, the weathered rancher, thought his days of connection were over. And Ruth, the woman running from a haunted past, never imagined she would be anything more than a shadow on someone else's land. But fate has a way of placing two broken souls in each other's path when the world believes they're beyond repair. Their story began with suspicion-hardened gazes and a silence so deep it echoed louder than words. But even in that silence, something stirred. They began to see each other not just as strangers, but as survivors. Ruth saw past the gruffness of Caleb's voice to the man who once loved so deeply he never dared to try again. Caleb saw in Ruth not just fear, but fight, not weakness, but will. Every fence they mended together became a metaphor for what they were trying to rebuild inside themselves. Every morning they woke up and faced the desert sun. They proved that healing is not swift nor always visible. It is found in consistency in showing up when it would be easier to stay hidden. When the bandits returned and brought violence to their doorstep, the test was not just of bullets and bravery, but of commitment. Would they retreat back into the solitude they knew? Or would they stand not just for each other, but for the life they were building? They stood. Together they fought off the darkness. And in doing so, they uncovered the truth about what it means to be alive. Life is not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep moving through it. It's in the way Ruth stood guard, pitchfork in hand, against the men who hunted her. In the way Caleb risked everything for someone he could have easily turned away. In the quiet moment after the dust settled, when two people shaken and bloodied sat on the porch not to talk, but simply to be. And from that moment on, things changed. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness began to breathe again. They welcomed others who carried burdens like theirs. A widow and her grandson. Veterans, strays, people who thought they had no place to go. The ranch became a sanctuary, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. They didn't pretend that healing made the past disappear. They honored their pain by making space for others to heal too. Ruth transformed her grief into growth, tending horses, offering lessons, planting wildflowers in the hard earth. Caleb, the man once defined by loss, taught others the value of stillness, of paying attention, of listening, not just with ears, but with the heart. The story of Caleb and Ruth teaches us that you don't have to wait to feel strong before you begin again. Strength is often found in the very act of starting. They weren't ready when life called on them to rise, but they rose anyway. And in doing so, they discovered that the things we believe disqualify us, our pain, our past, our failures, are often the very things that qualify us to lead others toward healing. Their journey is a reminder to us all. No matter how long you've wandered, no matter how many miles you've put between yourself and the person you used to be, it's never too late to come home. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a purpose. Sometimes it's the quiet acceptance of your own worth. So what can we learn from this? First, that healing is rarely loud. It doesn't demand a spotlight. It happens in the daily grind, in the soft looks, and the refusal to give up. Second, that love is not always passion. Sometimes it is patience. Sometimes it is the willingness to pick up someone else's load when yours is heavy too. And third, that hope is not naive. It is the most courageous thing we can cling to in a world that gives us every reason to let go. Apply these lessons to your own life. Reach out to someone you've been avoiding. Apologize when it's hard. Stay when it would be easier to run. Believe in the slow miracle of growth. You don't have to be whole to begin, just willing. And if you found yourself moved by the story of Caleb and Ruth, if their quiet triumph has stirred something in you, we invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to our channel, not just to support what we do, but to become part of a community that believes in stories, that heals stories that matter. Because somewhere out there, someone is still standing in the dust waiting for a reason to believe again. Be that reason. And let us keep telling stories that remind the world that even in the harshest desert, the sun still rises. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling, and for sharing this journey with us. We'll see you in the next story.